Chocolate? Chocolate! Chocolate!
Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome to another countdown. Today we're going to look at the last of the classic SpongeBob seasons, that being SpongeBob Season 3. Now, this is a season I have a much more complicated relationship with than the previous two. If you would have asked me a couple years ago what my favorite season of SpongeBob was, I would have told you the third season. And why not? Because at its best, it definitely is. But this season has certain issues that the other seasons just don't have. And because of this season's weird production during the making of the SpongeBob movie, you can definitely tell near the end of the season the tides of the show are moving in a very different direction. What I'm saying is the season starts much better than it finishes and is incredibly inconsistent. But even still, when the season's great, it's amazingly great, and some of the best episodes are at the end of the season, even if it really hits its stride in the first half. The thing that is unique about this season is that it's the first where I feel like the only real focus is jokes. If it's funny, roll with it. Yeah, SpongeBob is a comedy show, and for most of the first two seasons, it did put comedy first and foremost. But at the same time, a lot of episodes definitely focused on some other things as well. Like a really creative story or some interesting character aspects. And there were some episodes in Season 2 that I do think put plot as its main focus. Not as much in Season 3, though. Pretty much every episode's concept is used to tell as many great jokes as possible, and nothing else. Yes, there are exceptions, but that is 99% of the season, pretty much. And it works for the most part because of how wickedly funny the season is. This is the funniest season of the show, hands down. If Season 2 is where they really found their funny bone, then Season 3 is when they hit a gold mine with it. As someone who appreciates Season 2 and how it goes about its episodes, and it's interesting to think how certain Season 3 episodes would have turned out differently if they were made in Season 2, I gotta say, as long as the jokes work, which they pretty much always do, I'm perfectly fine with this direction. At least for now. But this means more than ever, when the jokes don't work, the episodes really suffer. Also, I think the fact that this season is the most joke-heavy the show has ever been leads to the fact when the writers try to do something a bit bigger and something beyond that, like 22-minute specials, they don't really work. And while these examples are far and in between, there's still a surprising amount of them. And there's more episodes I don't care for here than in any season so far, and a few I downright don't like. But I'll talk about the worst episodes of the first 3 seasons next time. These factors, along with me personally liking Season 2 style of episodes more, and how it goes about things, and it just being more consistent, keep Season 3 from being my personal favorite. Even if it is hands down the funniest, and its best episodes might just be stronger than Season 2's. But the seasons aren't drastically different from each other in many ways, and are pretty interchangeable in a lot of ways as well. Though, for making this list in particular, choosing my favorite episodes this time around came down to which ones I found the most funny, unlike the last 2 seasons where I took some other things into consideration. Here, I pretty much just took the comedy into consideration. Because it just didn't matter this time around, and the best episode is the funniest one. Every episode on this list, besides one, is put in its placement based on that. So, in this competition of comedy, Who is the king? Well, let's find out. Here is my top 5 best SpongeBob Season 3 episodes. Starting off this list, we have my favorite Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode. Sure, 3 has a ton of great jokes, but not only do I think this episode is funnier, but it actually involves Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy in an interesting way and goes much further with its concept because of just how much fun they have with the superhero aspect of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy being in the show. But I'll get into that in a little bit. Let's first mention the big thing, just how funny this whole concept is. Barnacle Boy turning evil for the most ridiculous reasons, so SpongeBob and gang have to help old Mermaid Man stop him and the other villains, which leads to the most chaotic and poorly done superhero work you will ever see. It's all so hilarious, and they use this fun concept to get as many jokes as possible out of every scene while playing around with cliches of certain superhero tropes and getting a ton of joke mileage out of that as well. From how overdramatic the opening is, to the fact that they build up Barnacle Boy and this team he's part of to be really evil, even though when they show them actually doing something together, they're playing Ding Dong Ditch. Also, every villain is Lemons, although they did spell villain wrong. Oh, also, there's a great scene of our characters trying out the costumes and showing off their new powers so they can help Mermaid Man, and this entire scene is great because of how it spoofs some of the more cheesy aspects of superhero comics. Oh, and let's not forget the Chief, who is probably the best part of this episode because of how funny and out of place he is, while at the same time feeling pretty in place, and just how over the top he is. It's really weird how he fits in, but he's really funny. Oh, and also, the villains are a subsidiary of Viacom. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean the heroes are a subsidiary of Viacom. My mistake. I can't believe I would say such a thing. And to top all these great jokes off, the place they locate Barnacle Boy and his gang to is Makeout Reef, where they're terrorizing random teenagers. It's all just so funny, but the final confrontation with our heroes and villains has to take the cake for the funniest part. After seeing them set up to be these superheroes who need no experience to use these costumes because the costumes have all the power, to watch them all fail miserably in the most random and over-the-top ways when the villains haven't even touched them is just gut-bustingly hilarious. So yeah, this is a great superhero-themed episode that uses Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy's presence in the show in the absolute best way possible to get such great comedic material out of every scene, and just have so much fun with this superhero aspect in a way no other SpongeBob episode really does. The last thing I want to mention, however, is I like how they look at Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy's relationship in this episode. They use it to set up and end the episode well, and it does kind of give you a new perspective on these characters while wrapping their set of episodes up for the original seasons perfectly. It adds a teeny bit of an emotional core to this episode, because it makes you care about these characters a little bit more, and a bit more interested in their struggles and their rivalry and just their relationship in general. It's just a little extra bonus to the episode, which leads into such a funny superhero plot with so many good jokes. But it's still heartwarming in the end, which adds to its greatness. But it's only number 5 and just barely made the list over many different contenders. But its humor was what landed it here. And even though it did just make the list, there are still 4 episodes that I find a bit more funny. Now this is an episode I think everyone was expecting to make the list somewhere, and for obvious reasons. It's one of the most popular episodes of the show, and one of the funniest. I don't want each and every one of these sections to be me listing off jokes, unless I have something really interesting to say on that matter. So this section won't be too long, but I will still say this episode just has a great concept, which leads to a ton of great jokes. Its appeal is really that simple. The first half of the episode, where SpongeBob and Patrick have to paint Mr. Krabs' house without getting paint on anything, is really tense but funny for how many great jokes and quotable moments there are, and because if they do get paint on anything, because the paint is permanent, or at least they're told it's permanent, Mr. Krabs is going to punish them dearly, which adds to the tension. But back on the comedy aspect, the banter between these two characters, along with this tension, is what really makes the episode. Along with an even better second half, where they have to figure out how they can get the paint off of Mr. Krabs' dollar before he comes home, and that just leads to all these weird and different ways they try to do that, because even though they are told that it's permanent, they believe that something must take the paint off, and nothing ends up doing that. And then when Mr. Krabs does show up, they try to hide it from him, and it doesn't work. And that ending is such a slap in the face, but in the best possible way. And through all of this, the tension and the comedy just gets better and better, and makes the whole episode amazing. It's so funny, after all this tension and great jokes, how meaningless the whole situation was, and the answer to all their problems was so simple. But what makes it even better is Mr. Krabs gets a sorta comeuppance for being inconsiderate, in more ways than one, in a really clever way. Yeah, this episode doesn't have as cool of a concept as something like Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 5, and a lot of the honorable mentions, but it's funnier than those episodes, and it uses its great sense of tension and quotable lines, and just its comedy in general to make it as far as it did on this list. But it's still only number 4, and you want to know an episode that is even funnier, that you're all probably expecting to be number 1? Well, what the episode my channel name and profile picture is based around isn't number 1 on the list, and only number 3? Well, yes. As I said, Season 3 has some of the funniest episodes, so even though I love this episode and every joke in it, hell, I love one particular character enough that I've branded my channel after him, it's still only number 3 because it's just not as funny as the 2 episodes coming up. Well, at least it's not as funny as number 1. Number 2 is a very different story though. Before we get into what topped it, let me explain what makes this episode so good. Patrick and SpongeBob being chocolate bar salesmen is such a great concept. Everyone they try to sell chocolate to, and all the different but weird ways they try to achieve their goal of becoming entrepreneurs, leads to a very different joke and outcome. This is one of the most unique and diverse episodes as far as its jokes and premises go. Every joke is something different, and they all hit 100%. They're all great, and they make this episode what it is. From the con man to the old ladies, and every single Patrick moment, to probably the best SpongeBob joke and one-off character, the chocolate guy. Honestly, I feel like I should have more to say, but this is just another episode that's greatness is very self-explanatory. It's just a great plot that leads to so many different jokes, and all of them are hilarious, and it's one of the funniest episodes on television because of that. but there are still 2 episodes that are better, even though this episode is really creative, and there are so many unique jokes around every corner, and everything works, and every aspect works in the episode's favor to just create the most funny experience. Season 3 was just that good when it came to humor that 2 episodes did still top it. I've been waiting forever to talk about this episode, which is why I thought I'd have a bit more to say. But in the end, some of these episodes just weren't that interesting to talk about because of just how self-explanatory they really were. Because they're just funny. Plain and simple, they're really funny. Though the next episode isn't above this one for reasons you might think after my little spiel here. Alright, here we go. Chocolate with Nuts was going to be my number 2 episode for the longest time, but randomly while watching the season, I had an accident just struck such a chord with me, I added it to the list last second, and honestly debated for a little while if I could justify putting it at number 1. Obviously, it didn't make it to that position, but dang was it close. As I said earlier, every episode except one is on this list due to comedy. Well, this is the exception. Sure, this episode is gut-bustingly hilarious, and while I'm not sure if it is funnier than Chocolate with Nuts, it's at least in the same ballpark as that episode, so it is still an amazingly funny episode. The whole scene of SpongeBob hurting himself is funny because of all the weird fake-outs and some funny little moments. All the contrived ways SpongeBob feels like his butt is put in danger after all he goes through and goes to the hospital to repair it, and Sandy and Patrick's different ways to try to get SpongeBob to come outside, and the weird way SpongeBob spends his time inside is all so funny. All those different jokes and all those different scenes are really well handled and get a laugh out of me every time. And all of it leads to a very weird but especially funny ending that I'll get to in a little bit. On top of all these great scenes and jokes, there's just a lot of little quirks to this episode, which adds a lot of character and uniqueness to it, even compared to some of its other Season 3 contemporaries, which use its comedy in so many different ways. I think this one is still a crowning achievement for very creative use of comedy and very creative jokes, even compared to something like Chocolate with Nuts. So, I think I've proven this episode at least deserved a mention in this video, because of how funny it really is, but once again, that's not why it's so high on the list. As I'm recording this segment, it is currently February 26, 2021. At least where I am in Minnesota, we are still in the middle of a pandemic. I haven't been at my school for learning purposes in almost over a year. I spend most of my time inside doing random things and rarely leaving the house because a lot of the time there's just no reason to, especially because it's really cold outside and I'm not going anywhere anyways. Although it has got warmer recently, so that's good. Spring is on its way here. So to see SpongeBob trap himself inside for weird reasons and never leaving his home, doing the most strange things to keep himself happy and satisfied, and there are constantly people trying to convince him to come outside, and in the weirdest way, he's proven right. Even though he's treated to be crazy throughout the entire episode, he's still proven right for even weirder reasons. Just hits such a chord with me. I just get so into this situation watching it play out, and am so curious to see where it's gonna go next, because I can strangely connect to aspects of SpongeBob's experience as he acts weird during all of this in this situation where he's inside. And yeah, obviously I can't really relate to how he's specific and the certain things he does well inside. I can definitely just connect to that feeling of trying to entertain yourself while being stuck inside for long periods of time, having very limited contact with the outside world. And it is represented in a really funny way with all the other weird stuff going on outside to add to the comedy. Even if this episode definitely portrays SpongeBob as crazy, which makes it and all the other jokes even funnier, but it also has it both ways in a sense with that ending. Yes, I know the ending is really nonsensical, and I know many people think it is really dumb, but I actually think it ends up working out. Because it's so out of left field and makes no sense, but I'm glad they chose to do this random ending and completely roll with it. But it does kind of prove SpongeBob's point in a weird way, wrapping up this conflict perfectly, but even that's a stretch. It's just a random as hell but funny ending that wraps up a very strange and hilarious episode in the best way. And I love it so much because of just how weird it is, but how it still fits with the rest of the episode. It's so weird, but it's so funny, and I love it a lot for just how strange it is. And I'll end the segment here. For these reasons, I did want to put this episode at number 1 for everything I mentioned, and put it there at the very last second. But my favorite episode of the show is in this season. And even with how creative this episode is, and how much I can connect to certain aspects of it, because of just how well it conveys that weird feeling of having to be inside for long periods of time, because there's some reason why you can't go outside that much. It's just so great and interesting, but I don't know how long that connection will last. Even if I think this is an underrated episode and one of the show's best, I don't know if I'm still gonna think that in a couple years or so. With my number 1, I definitely think I'll love it till the end of days. So that's why this is number 2, but man, was it very close to making the number 1 spot. But it was just beat out. But before we get into what my favorite episode of SpongeBob is, here are 15 honorable mentions that deserve a shout out for being some of the best of such a funny season. This episode was very close to making the list. It has such a good concept, and they go with the most over-the-top version of it they possibly could, and it leads to so many funny character bits and over-exaggerations of normal characters, and just a ton of good jokes in general. Also, we do get a cool insight into some interesting things involving what it would be like to be Mr. Krabs if every aspect of his life was played up in 10 times more crazier than normal. It's a lot of fun, but Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 5 was just funnier. So apparently an amount of people don't like this episode, and I'm not really sure why. It puts SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick in a really weird situation while telling a lot of great jokes. It's just SpongeBob and the rest dealing with being stranded in the middle of nowhere in different ways, and the interactions between the main characters, and adding this weird magic conch shell to it all, which I gotta say is really funny. How they blindly believe everything this novelty toy says, and how they're given weird random reasons to do so. Squidward's reactions to this are the best part, and after being a jerk many times throughout this episode, it is pretty satisfying to watch and really funny. I'll admit this episode is kind of repetitive with its structure and running jokes, and I could maybe see how someone thinks Squidward's being punished unfairly and this is just SpongeBob and Patrick being an idiot and being a jerk to him, but I do think it works, and I think the episode is really funny and still a great one either way. One of the best Squidward-centric episodes that uses the format of Squidward feeling like he is above everyone to not get into something, and then when he does get into it, he gets way too into it, leading to a bunch of bad things happening, and it just uses that format to its fullest potential, leading to so many great jokes and moments. This episode is jam-packed with great things. It's not the only episode this season that uses the format, but it's probably the best. Such a creative episode. SpongeBob being threatened to get beat up by his bully for literally no reason, and just him having to deal with this situation in so many different ways is so funny, and leads to a lot of great jokes and really interesting scenes. They just get so much out of this concept, and while it's not the funniest episode of the season, it's definitely one of the most creative and cleverest. Especially that ending. I can't even talk about this episode without chuckling. This episode is about SpongeBob and Mr. Krabs thinking they killed the health inspector and trying to bury him while failing to notice he is still alive in the most comedic but dark ways, and dealing with a few other things around that concept. It's just so dark, but in the best way, because this episode has a really great sense of dark humor. Sure, this episode can be a bit over the top for my liking, and a bit repetitive as well, but it's just so funny, and it's really impressive how they managed to deal with something like this, make it really funny, and get it past censors. It's just such an impressive episode. Another episode that uses the Squidward episode format I mentioned earlier in really fun ways. The plot just fits these characters so much. Squidward not being able to understand why SpongeBob and Patrick's imagination is being personified when they're in this box as he's trying to enjoy his new TV is an interesting concept, and they get many funny scenes out of it. I like Squidward trying to figure this out based on who he is as a person. And the ending, while it could have been really mean-spirited, it ends up being really fitting and end the episode off on a good note. Also, it ends with the bad pun. Enough said. Another episode that uses that Squidward formula. It's just a fun episode where SpongeBob and Patrick have a snowball fight with a ton of great jokes and moments coming out with just how extreme it is. And Squidward plays an interesting role in this conflict to make it all the better. This is one of the most complete episodes of the season. So many different things happen, and it goes to so many interesting places, while having good jokes and surprisingly telling a good story for how many different directions this episode takes, and how they play up the cartooniness at points in this episode more than most of the season, surprisingly enough. I did want to put it on this list for being so interesting and taking its concept to so many different places, but I still find episodes like Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 5 to be more interesting and funnier. Another really funny episode. What can I say? It's about Squidward having to live with SpongeBob after getting fired for supposedly stealing Mr. Krabs' first time. And it just leads to many great scenes and a great back and forth between SpongeBob and Squidward over how he's treating SpongeBob. Sure, the ending is kind of dumb, but it's still a fun and very interesting episode because of the back and forth between these two characters and this conflict in general. Either way. Oh, would you look at that? Another amazingly funny episode. Who knew? Well, this episode is about SpongeBob trying to get into a super tough guy club, and, of course, it's one of the funniest episodes of the entire series, because of how much of a weenie they make SpongeBob look like as he's trying to get into this club, in more subtle and explicit ways. Also, all of his weird schemes are fun as well, but the episode isn't as funny as what made the list. A great sequel to Band Geeks and a great use of Squilliam. It's just a fun restaurant-themed plot with a lot of twists and turns, which leads to some amazing jokes. While I really don't think there's anything amazing here, I don't have any issues with it. And I think the dialogue in this episode is just so spot on between our main characters as this event plays out, which really makes the episode for me. Another fun episode about SpongeBob and Squidward thinking Mr. Krabs is a robot, and it plays out in a very buddy cop sort of way, which is awesome. It's just cool seeing these two characters together dealing with what they think is a legitimate situation. They bounce off of each other really well in normal fashion, and it leads to many great scenes involving their conflict with Mr. Krabs. And while obviously from the start, we the audience know Mr. Krabs isn't a robot, they do enough so you understand why they think he is, which makes the entire situation and how it plays out all the more funny. There's a panty raid in this episode. Yes, in an episode of SpongeBob. I can't believe the show is on Nickelodeon either. But anyways, this is just an interesting episode where Mr. Krabs tries to feel young again, with lame SpongeBob and Patrick leading him into all these weird, stupid situations and things they try to get him to do, including a panty raid on what he later figures out is his mother's house. Yeah, the entire night they do the most lame, mundane, or trivial things, and then all of a sudden they go on a panty raid. It's so strange, but really funny. So, yeah, did I mention this episode is weird, but in the best way. And they get so much humor out of these scenes, and I can't stress this enough. The panty raid scene has me in tears because of how inappropriate it is. Another classic where all the jokes work and was very close to making the list, even though it was just beaten out. But don't get me wrong, seeing SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward camping in front of their house is hilarious and leads to too many good jokes to count. And the sea bear scene is truly the cherry on top of this, camping-themed Sunday. It's just really good, guys. The last great episode in seasons 1 through 3, and it is great. SpongeBob accidentally harming the Strangler when he doesn't know it is amazing, and all the different jokes they get out of it, even after everything, he still can't tell that this is the Strangler, and all these things lead to a fun climax, and it all just works, etc., etc. This really was a great season, with so many funny episodes, but what could top all that? Well, number 1. Yes, this is my favorite episode, and here's why. The Krusty Krab training video just has the best concept for a SpongeBob episode. A training video for the Krusty Krab is such a unique idea that if done poorly, could have been really dumb. But it ends up being the funniest episode of the series. Yes, I mean it. Simply put, this episode is just gushing with creativity. Because of this weird style, they're allowed to tell pretty much any joke they want, revolving around the workings of the Krusty Krab and using our characters in so many interesting ways. Well, we have a really funny narrator going over everything that's happening. This episode pretty much just follows SpongeBob as he is learning to be a full Krusty Krab employee, as the episode shows off every aspect of working at the Krusty Krab, and what roles you'll have to fulfill, and this is where most of the comedy comes from. Each thing they show off is shown in the funniest and cheesiest way ever. It plays up the fact it's a training video and makes fun of really stupid aspects of training videos. If you've ever had to watch a training video, you know that this is what they're like, and this episode has so much fun with that. It leads to all these scenes showing off things being even funnier because of how overly in-depth they go into some things and how they brush over others. And they show all this off in such a comedic way. How they try to go into the backstory of the Krusty Krab, but completely gloss over it, which leads to some funny jokes, and how they talk about emergency situations, and all SpongeBob does is run around screaming while Mr. Krabs is the one who solves the entire thing. But then they go into ludicrous amounts of depth about personal hygiene and where everything is at SpongeBob's workstation. And this leads to a ton of great character bits because of how they play around with this plot, from Squidward and Patrick's exchange and the narrator's back and forth with SpongeBob, to just the role the narrator plays in general. How sometimes people can interact with him and other times they can't, which is another funny trope of training videos, and they play this up so much, especially in the Patrick and Squidward scenes. But even with all that great stuff, this episode uses its format to tell even more good jokes you wouldn't get in any other episode. That's just how good it is. From stuff like Hoopla and Poop. People order our patties. The money is always right. Nobody wants to be a Squidward. Ahem. Graph. Just so many great ones to get. Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. Krabs, can I have a raise? No. Good job, Mr. SquarePants. Can I make a Krabby Patty now? Just so many great jokes. I could go on, listing quotable moment after quotable moment, and they're all hilarious. And all these little moments, along with the main jokes and scenes that really benefit from just how much fun this episode has with its concept and how far it goes with every single joke it tries to tell. And there are so many of them in so many creative ways. And even with that, there's even more minor jokes that you won't notice until watching it more, because simply put, this is probably the most detailed episode of the show. Yeah, most of the great episodes in SpongeBob seasons 1 through 3 have jokes that are in the forefront and some minor jokes, but here it's turned up to 100 with how many just little subtle jokes there are throughout most of it. I've seen this episode so many times, and even now, I'm still noticing stuff I never realized before. That this graph they show to show that the Krusty Krab is improving and gaining money actually proves the opposite and shows that they're losing money. It's so blatantly obvious, but there's just so much going on and so many great jokes that I just caught it this time around, and it made me laugh so hard. And there's so many other things just like that, which makes it the most rewatchable episode of the series, because each time it's just as funny as the last, maybe even more so, and a fresh experience in a sense. You could tell they really pulled out all the punches with how they went about this concept and every scene to even the most minor detail to make this the best episode. And they succeeded. Because not only is it the most creative episode that gets the most out of its concept, but it's also the funniest because of all the amazing jokes it has on so many different levels, and it's really no competition. Even with stuff like Chocolate with Nuts or I Had an Accident, I still think this episode goes so much further with its concept to get even more great jokes, and those jokes are just funnier. And in such a funny season like Season 3, that says a lot. But I think I've made my point. It's truly the best episode of the show for me, for all the reasons I mentioned, and I doubt any episode in post-movie SpongeBob will top it. Oh, I almost forgot to mention the wickedly trollish ending, because I have a lot to say. The ending to the Krusty Krab training video is, and with that, the list is done. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm sorry this list didn't come out when I originally was planning on releasing it. So I hope it was worth the wait. And to make up for the fact I didn't release 2 lists last month, like I promised, next week I'm going to release the top 5 worst SpongeBob episodes, seasons 1 through 3 lists, and then at the end of the month, I will release my top 5 best Simpsons season 5 episodes list. So including this video, there will be 3 of these big lists that I'm gonna release this month. And I'm gonna use a big chunk of time I have off from school to achieve this. As usual, if you enjoyed this, please leave a like and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Any additional support really helps motivation-wise. Also, leave a comment down below telling me what you thought of my video and what your own list would have been. I'd love to hear what you have to say. With all that said, the top 5 worst SpongeBob seasons 1 through 3 episodes list will be coming next week. And until then, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.